Good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the weekly political agenda. We are still discussing the ongoing crisis in Syria. U.S. President Barack Obama used a nationally televised address last night to outline the evidence that his administration has the proofs that the Syrian government was behind the deadly chemical weapons attack near Damascus on August 21st. Obama said, "No one disputes that there was a chemical weapons attack, and his administration, along with its allies, know that Assad's regime was responsible." Meanwhile, U.S. President Barack Obama announced he has asked the Congress to postpone voting on whether to take military action against Syria so that a diplomatic solution could be pursued. The view was President Barack Obama pledged on Tuesday to explore a diplomatic plan from Russia to take away Syria's chemical weapons, but voiced skepticism about it and urged Americans to support his threat to use military force if needed. Let's take a look at this report and we'll come back for further discussion.
In his address to the nation, U.S. President Barack Obama asked Congress on Tuesday to delay the vote on whether the United States should intervene militarily, vowing to give long-shot diplomacy a chance, as he warned Americans that for reasons of national security, they couldn't simply look away after innocent children were gassed to death in an attack he blames on Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's regime.
This initiative has the potential to remove the threat of chemical weapons without the use of force, particularly because Russia is one of Assad's strongest allies. I have therefore asked the leaders of Congress to postpone a vote to authorize the use of force while we pursue this diplomatic path.
Barack Obama said he would dispatch Secretary of State John Kerry to Geneva to meet his Russian counterpart for talks on Thursday. He said that it was simply not an option for America not to respond to the August 21st chemical weapons attack.
I determined that it is in the national security interests of the United States to respond to the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons through a targeted military strike. The purpose of this strike would be to deter Assad from using chemical weapons, to degrade his regime's ability to use them, and to make clear to the world that we will not tolerate their use.
Syria said on Tuesday it's ready to unveil and seize the production of chemical weapons as Western powers prepared to discuss a Russian plan for the country to surrender its chemical arms. Meanwhile, Britain, the United States, and France decided to table a UN Security Council resolution on Syria today, Wednesday, hoping to achieve a major goal: to get the chance to Bashar al-Assad to get rid of the chemical weapons, as Syria has the largest stockpile in the world.
In our talks with Lavrov, we are ready to state where the chemical weapons are, to halt production of chemical weapons, and show these installations to representatives of Russia, other countries, and the UN.
We know that his regime gave orders to prepare for a chemical attack. We know that they deployed forces and put them in the places where this took place. We know by tracing it physically where the rockets came from and where they landed. And it is no accident that they all came from regime-controlled territory and all landed in opposition-controlled or contested territory. We know this.
Also on Tuesday, Bahrain's Foreign Minister Sheikh Khalid bin Ahmed Al Khalifa said in a news conference in Jeddah that the Russian proposal for Syria to place its chemical weapons under international control to avoid a Western strike wouldn't stop bloodshed.
The situation of the GCC countries didn't change. We've heard of the initiative. It's all about chemical weapons, but doesn't stop the spilling of the blood of the Syrian people. The Gulf Arab states have been among the strongest proponents of intervention against Assad, who is backed by Shiite Iran, their main rival for influence in the region.
Meanwhile, the Arab League held today, Wednesday, an urgent session to discuss the Russian-backed plan under which Syria will hand over chemical weapons in return for it. This meeting comes upon the request from the GCC Council to discuss the latest in Syria.
Today's meeting is assuring that we are not facing only the chemical weapons in Syria, but also to face other weapons, as it must be under the international supervision.
After days of confused diplomacy, the question now is what the United States of America and the international community is prepared to do about it. Just the next days have the answer. For Political Agenda, this is Mona Farag.
Well, the viewers, the speech of President Obama actually shocked the whole world, and an analysis of the speech of Barack Obama, the American president, by Nihad Awad from Washington with our reporter from Washington. Let's hear what Nihad Awad says about the American president's speech, and welcome back.
I think the president realized that he has to make a clear case to the American public that there will be no boots on the ground, and we're not going to get involved in the Syrian civil war, and we have a limited target list to execute to send a message to President Bashar al-Assad that he cannot and should not and will not be able to do it again. He cannot use chemical weapons to gas people to death. That is the message. And I believe the president assured the American public that he's not going to go beyond this. It is not going to be costly to America, but it's going to be costly ethically to America if America turns its back on a human suffering that can be stopped. While the world community is silent, America should not be silent.
Joins me tonight in Washington, D.C., David Mack, former Vice President of the Middle East Institution, former U.S. Ambassador, and former Deputy Assistant for the Middle East. From New York, Dr. Abdulhamid Sayyam, Professor of Political Science at the University of New Jersey, Rutgers. Last but not the least, Dr. Abdelaziz Aluwaisheg from Riyadh, Assistant Secretary General of the GCC for International Negotiations. Welcome all of you to the program. Allow me to start with you, Dr. Abdelaziz Aluwaisheg. How do you read the latest developments in the what has been said by the American president, and how do you read the situation in general?
I think it proved one thing, proved that the threat to use force to punish Bashar al-Assad made him pay attention. This is the first time we have seen Bashar al-Assad actually pay attention. And that's why I hope that he doesn't read the detour that President Obama has taken by giving diplomacy a chance. I hope that Bashar al-Assad doesn't read that as that the military option is off. Because we need him to stay focused and think about a political solution.
Okay. Ambassador David, sir, why in your point of view the American president have changed his point of view? All the people were expecting that the attack or the retaliation against using the chemical weapons would be soon. Now he's giving another chance for the regime to regroup his forces and also probably for further discussions. And he's reading or accepting what the Russians said, that the chemical weapons of the Syrians will be under an international control. First of all, as a diplomat, how do you read what has been said by the American president, and what is your analysis to his speech?
I believe that the president is making use of a combination of determined diplomacy with the potential use of force. And he's doing this in a strategy to achieve two goals. The number one goal is to degrade the Syrian regime's capability of delivering chemical weapons against Syrian targets and potentially against targets in Turkey or Jordan. Secondly, to deter the Syrian government from ever using chemical weapons again. And finally, of course, there's a hope that we can build on this to get back to the idea of a political transition to a government that would be the product of negotiations between some people in the Syrian regime, more responsible officials, and the more responsible Syrian rebel organizations.
Dr. Sayyam, now you are in New York, sir. How do you read
Yes.
how do you read the situation, the United Nations situation towards? We know that the chemical weapons were used, as Secretary Kerry have said, 11 times in Syria alone, and we know how hard and how tough using chemical weapons. And in Ghouta, in the last massacre, 1,300 people were killed, and many or hundreds were injured to that to that attack. First of all, how do you see the answer, or what is going the United Nations, what is going to do against using chemical weapons in this part of the world?
Let me just say first that as we speak now, there is a meeting scheduled between the 5 permanent members of the Security Council to table a draft resolution which could be acceptable to all parties. And if they agree, they will put a resolution for a vote in the next few days about the initiative started by the Russians and then will be adopted by the Security Council. The other point which you raised in your question, I want to say that there is many defects in this global security system. The idea that Syria, for example, is not a member of the Chemical Prohibition Convention, and the idea that Syria is not a member of the ICC or the International Criminal Court, that makes it more difficult to bring some members of the Syrian government and the opposition to the ICC to be tried as violators of human rights and committing crimes against humanity. And that requires taking this issue to the Security Council. I mean, no one can take Syrian officials to the ICC except the Security Council. And that, again, will be faced with the Russian veto and possibly the Chinese veto. So we have these defects. I mean, there are many atrocities committed around the world, and the Security Council, if the 2 superpowers basically do not agree on a course of action, then nothing could be happened. So many atrocities committed in former Yugoslav Republic, in Bosnia, Croatia, Kosovo, many atrocities committed in Cambodia, in Namibia, in Congo, until the Security Council come together and adopt a unanimous resolution, and then the UN Secretariat is given the authority to implement that resolution, then these things could happen again and again.
Okay. Dr. Aluwaisheg, now, Secretary Kerry said after meeting some Arab foreign ministers in Paris that some Arab countries would announce their stand against the using of chemical weapons, and they are with a strong retaliation by the international community to to retaliate against the Syrian regime for using chemical weapons against his own people. There are also some reports that the Pentagon is planning a stronger attacks and a longer term attacks. First of all, how do you read the situation of the Arab League, I mean the Arab countries, after meeting Mr. Kerry in Paris? And well, Saud al-Faisal, the foreign minister, was among those people, and you know the stand of Saudi Arabia. Before we go on to Khalid al-Khalifa spoke a while ago about the situation. But in general, how do you read it? You're the Assistant Secretary General of the GCC.
Well, actually, I think there is agreement among all Arab countries on the use of chemical weapons. All Arab countries, with the exception of Syria and Egypt, are members of the Chemical Weapons Convention. So there is agreement. I think it's a consensus that chemical weapons should not be used, whether against civilians in Syria or anywhere else. So on that issue, I think everybody agrees. But what to do with a country that has been that has used them? Actually, I think that's where some countries prefer negotiated settlement, a political solution. Well, but the overwhelming majority, I think, believe that all options should be used to convince the Syrian government, A, to stop using chemical weapons, and B, to go for a political solution. And I think we have to distinguish between two issues. One, on the chemical weapons, and President Obama said that he's going to give the diplomacy a chance, but only to solve the chemical weapons issue. And we have to be realistic about what that could achieve. Think about Muammar al-Gaddafi. The United States negotiated with Muammar al-Gaddafi 10 years ago, 2003, on getting rid of Libya's chemical weapons. That took 10 years. So that could take a long time. And that, I think, will have very little effect on the conventional war that is taking place in Syria, unless, as I said earlier, unless the Syrian government uses this opportunity, this pause, and the focus of the international community on Syria to think about political options. But otherwise, I think it will have very little effect, because first you have to negotiate the deal. And the deal now, with the military option has been put off, the deal could take a long time. Could take weeks, could take days. I think some people talk about 10 days to reach a deal, but it could take weeks.
10 months.
And then, because the gap between the view of the Syrian opposition on the one hand and the United States and all the supporters of the Syrian people, the gap is very wide between that position and the position of the regime and the Russians and the Iranians. For example, the Americans and the Syrian opposition would like any action, any deal that is struck under the framework of the Security Council be under Chapter 7, which means violating it will have consequences, means that force could be sanctioned, could be used under the umbrella of the Security Council if the Syrian regime doesn't comply with whatever deal is struck. On the other hand, the Russians and the Syrian government would like any deal either not to have consequences at all, or if those consequences, it will be under Chapter 6, which means political means. So I think many things have to be negotiated, and there is no certainty.
Chapter 7, we need.
The agreement on a deal under Chapter 7 would be, I think, something that can at least, not guarantee, but can at least give us assurance that Bashar al-Assad is going to
obey or
comply with the deal that's being struck, because it will be issued by a United Nations Security Council resolution. The Russians are talking about a presidential statement by the Security Council, which is not binding. They're also talking about Chapter 6, which again is not enforceable. So I think it's important to keep in mind all of these obstacles towards reaching a deal, let alone executing it, which could take years, because the stockpile of chemical weapons that Syria has is tremendous. It could take more than 10 years, which took to destroy the Libyan stockpile. But I think that's one thing. But then what is going to happen to the other side of the war is going to continue as before.
Okay. Ambassador Mack, sir, how do you read what has been said by Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister? He said we are going to put the Syrian chemical weapons under the international control. As a diplomat and a politician, how do you read what has been said by Sergei Lavrov? And do you think it is to buy time, or they are serious this time? Because we remember a few weeks ago they said if the international community proves that the Syrian regime has used chemical weapons or unconventional weapons, we will stand against it. So how do you read what has been said by the Russian foreign minister, sir?
Actually, the Russian government has very strong feelings about the use of chemical weapons. They lost huge numbers of their soldiers in World War I on the battlefield to chemical weapons. And that's why they have been among the countries that pressed very hard to outlaw the use of chemical weapons in future warfare, and certainly to outlaw their use against civilian populations. I think that they're backed up, actually, in this regard, strangely enough, they're backed up by the Iranians because of the terrible memory the Iranians have of the use by Iraq of chemical warfare during the Iraq-Iran war.
Yeah, the Halabja massacre,
But
yes.
at the same time, I really agree with Dr. Abdelaziz when he says this will not solve the whole Syrian problem. It's only a beginning of solving the Syrian problem. And for that, there has to be future action by the United States, working with Jordan and Turkey to train and equip Syrian rebel units that are judged to be responsible. And there has to be cooperation of a diplomatic nature between Russia and the United States to bring representatives of both sides to the negotiating table for some kind of political settlement.
Okay. Professor Sayam, also, sir, now the American president has been trying to convince the Legislative Council or the Congress, and both the Senate and the Congress, to approve a retaliation against Syrian regime. Now he postponed it, but do you think he's going to be able with his administration to convince the Legislative Council of approving such an attack over Syria? And do you think if it happens, is it going to be short, precise hit, or it's going to take a long time, as Dr. Abdelaziz Aluwaisheg said, removal of Libyan chemical weapons took almost 10 years between the United States and Libya. Do you think it's going to take that time, or it's going to be a short and precise attack over the Syrian regime?
Oh, let me start with the first part. I mean, President Obama now, in his speech last night, he asked the Congress to delay the vote on the authorizing him to use weapons and to use force. So now he's giving diplomacy a chance. If this works, if diplomacy works, there will be a breakthrough, and Obama can take credit for that, since he used the threat of force was serious and tangible and overwhelming. So he could take credit, and he did, in fact, last night. He took credit that the Syrian regime had truly budged because of the threat of use of force. So if the breakthrough happens, so he could come back and take credit that we achieved without using force what we wanted to achieve, or we may achieve through force. However, if this diplomatic efforts failed and there was no UN resolution and they couldn't reach an agreement and some new obstacles had arisen by the Russians or by the Syrian regime or by whatever, now the Congress and even the American public will lean more towards supporting the president. He will come back forcefully to tell the Congress, look, I gave him a chance, it didn't work. I gave the Russians a chance, it didn't work. Now it's time for you to support me. Now, let's assume that happens, and now the Obama administration is confronted with this challenge, but he has now more support in the Congress. There are more public opinion in favor of retaliatory measures against the Syrian regime. I think Obama will take that mandate to the fullest. He will try to dislodge the Syrian regime of his weapons of mass destruction. He will knock out mostly about 40 to 50 installations and strategic areas, such as airports and headquarters and communication system, where the Syrian regime would be weakened so much that any negotiation in the future, he could go with a less powerful status. He will go weak, and the opposition will be in a better negotiation status. So I think Geneva too might happen, and both parties would come, but no, the Syrian regime cannot claim that he was victorious and he would go and try to dictate his term rather than submit to the international community negotiating team and compromises.
Okay. Dr. Aluwaisheg, now, sir, it's been almost 2.5 years or more, and every few months the international community wakes up and will take Geneva 2, will do the Friends of Syria in Istanbul, the Friends of Syria in Tunisia, in Paris, name it. We have held many conventions and many conferences, but seems resultless. No result has been taken. And with the new diplomacy, are we going to allow another 10,000s or thousands of Syrians to be murdered and to be killed and to be victimized and millions to be homeless and displaced? Do you think the diplomacy, sometimes we stand against, we all want diplomacy, but sometimes diplomacy cannot solve the situation, especially if the other party is using every diplomatic chance to use it against its own people?
Yes, I think many, including myself, many are concerned that the Syrian regime is not reading the signals correctly.
Exactly.
He may be reading the fact that 60% of Americans, according to the polls, are opposed to a military strike against Syria, and the fact that President Obama has asked the Congress to delay voting on using force. He's reading all these signals as weakness, and he's reading them as that President Obama is leading from behind, and that his policy is really a response to the polls. I'm just concerned that the regime is reading it that way, and his media certainly is portraying it that way. But I'm concerned that the regime actually believes its own propaganda. So I think there is a risk that negotiations with the Syrian government will embolden the regime, will give it more legitimacy than it has.
Exactly.
They'll make it an international player in its own eyes. And that could, I think, whether we reach a deal on chemical weapons or not, whether that deal could takes days or weeks or months, it may embolden the government, the regime, to use conventional weapons to try to do finish the opposition, and use his superior force to eliminate all of the opposition. I think there are risks there, and that's why I think many people are concerned that this diplomatic detour may backfire. On the other hand, I think they're the optimists, and I think probably my colleagues are among them, who think that this could change the frame of mind of the regime and make it think about a political solution, maybe make it go to Geneva 2. I think it's not clear. And a lot depends on how the Americans and others are going to use the next days and weeks. Is President Obama is going to use the next days while a deal is being negotiated on chemical weapons to sell the case for a military strike against Bashar al-Assad? Is he going to do that, or is he going to wait for another poll and then, make a move according to the polls?
Okay. Well, the viewers, a short pause, and then we'll discuss now. Will Geneva 2 happen? Where and what are going to be the results if it happens? Because it's been delayed from June to July to August, and now we are in September and nothing happened yet. Let's take a short pause and we'll come back. Aluwaisheg said that the Syrian government thinks what happened is a victory for them. But Ambassador David, I will come back. I need you to comment on that. But let me go to Washington. Geneva 2, in your point of view, Mr. Ambassador, is it going to happen? Why was it delayed? And why now is it going to be commenced? And do you think fruitful results will be considered at the end of Geneva 2 if it happens?
If the U.S. and Russia are successful with other members of the United Nations Security Council in working out a deal that is going to be implemented in a swift and realistic and verifiable way to remove those chemical weapons, put them under international control, and eventually destroy them. If that is successful, then I think the precedent will be for the United States and Russia to cooperate once again, this time in getting negotiations underway at under Geneva II between some representatives of the current Syrian government and some representatives of those rebel forces that are considered to be responsible. Now think about the advantage of the kind of international deal for getting chemical weapons under control and away from Syria. That means that not only can the Syrian government not use those weapons again, they can't transfer them to Hezbollah, and it will be impossible for some of the radical extremist rebel groups, such as Jabhat al-Nusra, to gain control of the chemical weapons themselves, which would be another kind of threat. So this will be a huge achievement, and I think it will encourage Moscow and Washington to work all the harder to get negotiations started between Syrian rebels and the Syrian government.
Okay. Professor Sayyam, we've heard it. Do you expect that Geneva II is going to be commenced in Geneva? And as Ambassador David said, that if it happens, then both Russia and the United States will play on diplomatic solutions. But if it happens, who's going to pay for the committed crimes for the past 30 months or more, by killing more than 100,000 people, using chemical weapons, using all the weapons, the prohibited weapons of the world against your own civilians, your own people? Do you think it's going to be forgiven and then we'll go to diplomacy, or do you think the international community will not allow, as been said by President Obama, by Kerry, by David Brown, by Holland, the French president, that they should be punished, so we teach other countries not to use chemical weapons against its own people?
I agree with my colleague, Professor Mac Davis, again, that if this breakthrough about the chemical weapons take place and become successful, both Russia and the United States will build on it for another attempt to convene Geneva II, and they can continue with that effort to finalize a peaceful agreement that will bring the Syrian crisis and the Syrian civil war to an end. Assuming that happens and there is an agreement, we have so many difficulties on convening Geneva II. And among the most difficult issues, who will represent the opposition? There are so many groups, they don't agree among each other. We have some people who had power on the ground are not even welcomed, and they will not be invited to Geneva II. While those who are supposedly truly represent the Syrian opposition, some of them are weaker and they disagree with each other. So that's another, but let's assume we overcame that problem. And here there is a solution, and we will be faced with the atrocities committed during the very months of civil war. There's so many crimes committed on both sides. I mean, the UN Council on Human Rights just released today a very chilling report about crimes committed by both sides. I mean, it even enumerates the massacres committed by the regime, which is about 7 or 8 of them, and 1 by the opposition. So there are massacres committed on both sides. Are they going to get free? Are they